Think medieval people spent their lives cloistered in prayer, terrified of sin, and wholly devoted to chastity. That image has been passed down for centuries, polished by moralists and romanticized in modern imagination. Yet reality was far stranger and, in many ways, far more human. Scratch the surface of medieval society, and you find a world where sex was never absent, only reframed, ritualized, and often absurdly policed. Take one of the most surreal courtship customs in history, bundling. Imagine you are a young man in a small medieval village. Your parents, eager to see you married, have arranged for you to meet a potential bride. You expect polite conversation, maybe a walk in the fields. Instead, you're led into her family's house, wrapped in a heavy sack, and tied into bed beside her. Sometimes a wooden board, an actual plank, was laid between the two of you, a literal barrier meant to protect virtue while still forcing intimacy. This was not a joke, not a punishment. It was courtship, endorsed by parents, embraced by communities, and practiced in countless rural households. The logic was almost comical. Let young couples test companionship by sharing warmth, but prevent them from going too far. Families believed that physical closeness might spark affection, while restraint would prove moral fiber. Entire industries sprang up to accommodate this practice. Special bundling bags were stitched, designed to hold two bodies together, while ensuring that hands and legs didn't stray where they shouldn't. It was the medieval version of a chaperone date, except with far more burlap, far less privacy, and infinitely higher stakes. Of course, the theory rarely matched reality. Hormones, after all, don't obey wooden boards. Historical records and local complaints suggest pregnancy rates among bundled couples were higher than among those who courted through ordinary visits. In trying to tame desire, bundling often fanned its flames. Priests railed against it from pulpits, calling it scandalous and immoral, yet they were powerless to stop it. The practice was too deeply woven into rural custom, too accepted by communities who saw it less as a sin and more as practical family life. Parents may have been naive, or perhaps simply resigned to the inevitable. Bundling wasn't unique to medieval Europe. Similar customs appear in surprising places. In Puritan New England centuries later, settlers brought the practice with them, allowing suitors to bundle as a supervised form of intimacy. In certain indigenous cultures of North America, trial marriages existed where couples lived together temporarily, with families watching closely to see if compatibility outweighed youthful passion. What's striking is how universal the impulse was. Communities everywhere tried to regulate desire, to shape it, and in doing so, often placed it in situations guaranteed to test restraint. For medieval parents, bundling was less about love and more about survival. Marriage wasn't just romance, it was economics, family alliances, and the hope of children who would carry on the household. Allowing suitors to spend the night under one roof, tied together, felt like a safeguard. Yet it was also a gamble, balancing between propriety and risk, between social order and the unstoppable pull of human nature. The irony, of course, is unforgettable. In trying to protect chastity, medieval families engineered one of history's most peculiar systems for encouraging intimacy. Nothing reveals the contradictions of the age more clearly than a mother sewing a bundling bag for her daughter, believing she was preserving virtue while, in truth, placing temptation just inches away. Medieval people didn't just flirt with intimacy in the bedroom. They set the stage for it at the dinner table. To them, food wasn't only nourishment, it was power, magic, and sometimes an open invitation to passion. The medieval obsession with aphrodisiacs blurred the lines between appetite and desire, turning kitchens into laboratories of lust and wedding banquets into rituals of fertility. Forget chocolates and strawberries. The centerpiece of medieval aphrodisiac cuisine was something far stranger. Animal testicles, bulls, rams, boars, all were prized, butchered, and consumed not just for protein but for what people believed was the essence of vitality itself. They called them stones, a polite euphemism to mask the reality. Recipes abounded, roasted with herbs, boiled in broth, fried in oil, ground into powder and mixed with wine. Physicians and cooks alike insisted that by consuming these organs of reproduction, one could inherit their potency. It was sympathetic magic at the dinner table, the belief that eating fertility could create fertility. But testicles were only the beginning. The brains of sparrows, tiny and fragile, were served with the promise of sparking sexual energy, for sparrows themselves were thought to embody lust. Pine nuts, almonds, and honey ingredients we recognize today as energy-rich were deliberately added to desserts, believed to sweeten the body and inflame desire. Even spices became charged with erotic meaning. Cinnamon, saffron, pepper, and ginger, transported at great expense from the East, were worth their weight in gold not just for taste, but for what they promised behind closed doors. To medieval households, the spice trade was less about cuisine and more about conjuring fire in the blood. The obsession didn't remain private, it spilled into spectacle. At weddings, families staged what were called love feasts, meals in which every dish carried symbolic weight. The bridal cake wasn't merely sweet, it was medicine for fertility. Guests would watch the bride and groom eat, interpreting the foods as signs of their future abundance. In noble courts, entire banquets were arranged to stoke desire, with one course after another designed to inflame the senses. Imagine attending a marriage feast where course 3 was boiled ramstones, course 4 sparrow pie, course 5 almonds, soaked in honey, all carefully chosen to ensure the union produced heirs. Some of these recipes survive in manuscripts that read less like cookbooks and more like medical treatises. Physicians wrote texts such as On the Generation of Semen or Foods That Increase Lust, filled with precise instructions on how to prepare sexual stimulants. To modern eyes, they read absurdly, but to the medieval mind, they were as scientific as astronomy or surgery. In fact, they were medicine, endorsed by scholars, debated by monks, and sometimes forbidden by church leaders during fasting periods. Certain foods, saffron in particular, were banned not because they were indulgent, but because they were too arousing for a body meant to focus on God. It is easy to laugh at the idea of eating ram testicles or sparrow brains for passion, but we should not underestimate the seriousness of belief. In a world where fertility meant survival, where the failure to produce an heir could doom a family's lineage, anything that promised potency was embraced. The kitchen became the theater of desire, where the right recipe could mean the difference between dynasty and extinction. And here lies the paradox. The very same society that preached restraint and condemned lust was also willing to spend fortunes on meals designed to inflame it. At a noble's table, food became ritual. At a peasant's table, even modest additions, garlic, honey, or spices, were understood as whispers of passion. To eat in the medieval world was never just to survive. It was to prepare, to kindle, and sometimes to surrender. Privacy, as we know it today, barely existed in the Middle Ages. And when it came to sex, privacy was not only rare, it was sometimes forbidden. Few customs illustrate this better than the ritual of the bedding ceremony, a practice that turned the most intimate act of a marriage into a public performance. Picture this. The wedding mass is over, the feast has been eaten, and the candles burn low in the hall. Instead of retreating to a chamber in secret, the newlyweds are paraded to their bed by a procession of guests, family members, nobles, even church officials. The bride is undressed by female relatives, the groom by his male kin, each gesture charged with symbolism. It was not meant to titillate but to bind, a ritual as serious as the signing of a treaty. And then, the couple is placed together in bed, while witnesses stand watch. Why? Because a marriage in the medieval world was more than love or companionship. It was a legal contract, a transfer of property, a merging of dynasties. That contract was not valid until it was consummated. In a society where inheritance disputes could tear kingdoms apart, there had to be proof. Proof that the union was sealed. Proof that heirs would be legitimate. And so, eyes lingered on the bed, waiting for evidence that desire and duty had joined hands. Sometimes the scrutiny was relentless. Witnesses did not always leave after the couple was settled. Some stayed through the act itself, offering encouragement, advice, even jokes to ease or pressure the moment. Others waited until morning to inspect the bed linens, searching for bloodstains that would confirm the bride's virginity. Sheets, those silent witnesses, could be paraded before courts as legal evidence. In some annulment cases, the absence of such stains doomed women to shame and suspicion, regardless of biology or circumstance. This was not a rare eccentricity reserved for kings. Across Europe, wherever property or alliances were at stake, bedding ceremonies were demanded. In noble houses of England and France, in German courts, in Italian palaces, it was an expected chapter of the wedding story. Even commoners, though with less pomp, could be subject to witnessed consummations if disputes arose. History records examples that verge on the tragicomic. In 1421, Margaret of France, the widow of Henry V, was wed to Arthur III of Brittany. Chroniclers note that the couple's bedding was attended by high-ranking nobles who solemnly observed their entry into bed. These witnesses were not scandalized, they were fulfilling duty, ensuring that dynastic power remained unchallenged. In another case, in 15th century Spain, a noble marriage was annulled after sheets were examined and judged insufficiently stained, condemning the bride for failing to prove what she may, in truth, have never had to prove at all. It is difficult to imagine the weight of such expectations. The night that should have been private discovery was instead a legal trial, overseen by family, clergy, and politics. The bedroom was transformed into a courtroom, the body into evidence, intimacy into public theatre. And yet, within this cruel ritual, one sees the anxieties of an age. Dynasties were fragile, bloodlines sacred. A single illegitimate heir could fracture kingdoms. Witnessed consummation was less about desire than about control, society's attempt to harness and monitor the most private force in human life. For the bride and groom, however, it must have felt like a theft of self. Their first night together belonged not to them but to the gaze of others. The laughter, the whispers, the candlelight pressing against their skin, every touch shadowed by the knowledge that they were not alone. In these ceremonies, medieval Europe institutionalized voyeurism, turning love into spectacle and sex into politics. It was not a night of union, but a performance staged for legitimacy, proof that desire could be monitored, measured, and made to serve the demands of lineage and law. If the bedding ceremony reduced intimacy to public theatre, what came after often turned it into calculation. In the medieval world, conceiving a child was not simply left to chance. It was a matter of survival. Dynasties depended on heirs, farms needed children to work the fields, and entire communities relied on strong families to endure famine, war, and plague. And so, the act of creating life became entangled with astrology, religion, and medicine, until sex itself felt less like passion and more like strategy. Physicians of the Middle Ages leaned heavily on humoral theory, inherited from Hippocrates and Galen. A woman was most fertile, they argued, when her body was hot and moist, her humors in balance, her complexion flushed with vitality. Conception, they believed, was easiest during the waxing moon, when the heavens themselves were swelling with growth. Planets, too, were thought to exert influence. A favorable alignment of Venus could bless fertility, while Saturn's cold gaze might doom it. Couples seeking children consulted not just midwives but astrologers, poring over charts with the same seriousness we might reserve for medical reports. The calendar of desire grew more complex under the watchful eye of the Church. Sex was forbidden on holy days, during Lent and Advent, on Sundays, Wednesdays and Fridays, and in times of menstruation, pregnancy, or breastfeeding. When the prohibitions were counted, nearly half the year was closed to conjugal relations. A devout couple who wished to remain in good standing with God had to navigate a labyrinth of restrictions, turning the pursuit of conception into something like a military campaign. Find the right saint's day, consult the stars, ensure the body's humors are balanced, and only then proceed. And then there were the instructions pages of them. Medical treatises advised couples not only on which day to conceive, but at what hour, under which weather conditions, even which direction the bed should face. East was favored, toward the rising sun, to imbue the child with vigor. Midnight was considered the optimal hour, when the world was still and the body's energies peaked. Some texts recommended physical rituals, special prayers, fasting, or wearing particular garments before the act itself, transforming conception into a liturgy of desire. The obsession extended to gender selection. To conceive a boy, one physician recommended tying off the left testicle, on the theory that the right produced sons and the left produced daughters. Others prescribed diets rich in red meat and wine for men, almonds and milk for women, to tip the scales toward masculinity. Girls, by contrast, were said to result from cooler, moister unions, sometimes influenced by planetary misalignment. The ignorance may seem laughable now, but to families desperate for male heirs, these instructions carried the weight of destiny. Among the wealthy, fertility became a business in itself. Nobles hired specialists, a curious blend of physician, priest, and astrologer, who prepared personalized schedules for conception. These fertility consultants would study the couple's horoscopes, health, and obligations to determine the precise window for successful intercourse. Some families even traveled to distant shrines or holy sites, convinced that geography could enhance fertility, that the soil beneath a saint's resting place might bless the union. And yet, for all the planning, all the rituals, infant mortality remained staggering. Perhaps 1 in 3 children died before the age of 5. Women risked their lives in childbirth with terrifying regularity. Behind the elaborate instructions lay a truth the medieval world could not escape. Life was fragile, and its creation remained a mystery beyond human control. Still, the effort to master it reveals much about the age. In medieval Europe, sex was never just a private exchange of desire. It was a negotiation with the cosmos, a dialogue with saints, a strategy for lineage and legacy. Couples lay together not simply for pleasure, but as actors in a drama staged by medicine, religion, and the stars themselves. If medieval sex could be timed by the stars and scrutinized by witnesses, it could also be dressed, adorned, and even armored. In an age where medicine was uncertain and childbirth perilous, people turned to charms and garments infused with symbolism, prayers, and a measure of desperation. Clothing, the most ordinary of human tools, was transformed into a talisman of desire and fertility. One of the strangest artifacts of the period was the so-called girdle of Venus. This was not a metaphor, but an actual belt woven from silk or linen, embroidered with prayers, or inscribed with astrological symbols. Wrapped around the hips or waist, it was believed to channel divine protection, ease childbirth, and ensure conception. To wear such a girdle was to carry both medicine and magic stitched into fabric. Wealthy families sometimes commissioned them from clerics or scribes, turning holy words into wearable charms. But the girdle was only one of many. Amulets were common, often small pouches worn close to the body, filled with powders or fragments thought to hold power. Some contained ground gemstones, emeralds, believed to foster male children, sapphires to encourage daughters, and diamonds for twins. Others contained what was claimed to be unicorn horn, more often narwhal tusk, imported at great expense from the Arctic seas. Each jewel, each shard of bone, was imagined as a conduit to the mysteries of fertility. Women inserted conception stones into their garments, convinced the stones themselves could sway destiny. Emeralds, sapphires, crystals, each chosen with care, each invested with hope. These were not ornaments of vanity. They were declarations of intent, talismans worn in bed as well as in church, signaling that faith and flesh were woven together. The marketplace for such objects was thriving. Priests blessed fertility belts and amulets in exchange for offerings. Merchants sold silk girdles threaded with gold to nobles, while peasants fashioned their own from scraps of cloth or leather, whispering local prayers as they tied them. In this way, magical underwear reflected the social order. The rich could afford luxuries stitched with gems, while the poor relied on homespun charms. Yet both believed in the same principle, that the body needed armor, that desire needed sanctifying. Men too had their share of accessories. Rings inscribed with prayers, worn on particular fingers, were thought to enhance virility. Some carried pouches containing dried animal organs, often, unsurprisingly, testicles. Others wore blessed loincloths, their fabric sanctified in church, as though holiness could be stitched into the very place where sin was most often imagined. What is striking is how institutionalized this commerce became. Priests did not simply tolerate such practices, they often participated. Church records show blessings given over belts, girdles, and sheets, with fees collected for the service. A woman preparing for marriage might visit not only a seamstress, but also her parish priest, ensuring that her garments were woven with prayer. In effect, the church became a middleman in the trade of desire, transforming private anxieties into holy transactions. The result was a kind of medieval subscription service for sex. Objects required renewal, blessings had to be repeated, and when charms failed, new ones were purchased. There are even surviving instruction manuals explaining how to fasten a girdle correctly, what words to recite while tying it, and how to respond if conception did not occur. Imagine flipping through a manuscript, not for fashion advice, but for directions on how to properly wear your blessed belt in bed. Behind the strangeness lies a human truth: fear. Childbirth was deadly, infertility, a curse, and lineage everything. In a world with no reliable medicine, people turned to what they had: cloth, stone, words, faith. To us, it seems absurd that a diamond could promise twins, or that a priest's blessing on a girdle could ease labor. But for them, these objects embodied hope. In the candlelit chambers of medieval homes, desire was rarely naked. It was clothed in symbols, layered in prayers, and wrapped in the fragile armor of belief. To prepare for intimacy was not only to prepare the body, it was to prepare the soul, the family, and the future. For all the rituals, charms, and ceremonies, marriage in the Middle Ages was often a prison with no escape. Divorce, as we know it today, was almost impossible under canon law. Marriage was a sacrament, indissoluble, except by death. And yet there was one narrow door left ajar: impotence. If a husband could not consummate the marriage, the union could be annulled. But to prove it, couples were dragged into one of the most humiliating spectacles of the medieval age, the impotence trial. The process began clinically, almost bureaucratically. Husband and wife were separated, examined by so-called experts, physicians, clerics, sometimes midwives who studied their genitals for any sign of defect. But anatomy alone was rarely enough. Next came questioning, under oath. How many times had they attempted sex? What exactly had failed? Had there been arousal, emission, orgasm? Every detail of their private lives was dragged into the open, recorded in the language of law. If testimonies and examinations proved inconclusive, the court invoked its most grotesque solution: the trial by Congress. The couple was ordered to attempt intercourse under supervision. Sometimes this meant being placed in a special chamber with officials watching through peepholes. In other cases, the performance took place in a hall, with physicians or clerics present to witness success or failure. A clock or an hourglass might be set, giving the man a fixed span in which to prove his virility. Should he falter, the marriage could be annulled. Some husbands tried to cheat. They smuggled in herbal mixtures, ointments, or animal parts, believed to stimulate potency medieval versions of Viagra. Courts grew suspicious, subjecting men to humiliating searches before the act. There are records of judges noting whether the husband entered the room armed with powders or bearing suspicious oils. Failure under such scrutiny was devastating, not only legally, but socially. A man branded impotent became the subject of village ridicule, his masculinity forever questioned. And what of the wives? They too endured public indignity. A woman seeking annulment had to prove she herself was capable of desire, that her body responded as it should. Midwives examined her for signs of arousal, and witnesses questioned her on whether she had been willing and warm. If she seemed too cold, the blame could be shifted onto her, not her husband. The very act of defending her dignity could end in further shame. Some cases stretched on for years, with repeated supervised attempts ordered by the court. Imagine being forced to perform your most private act again and again before strangers until the law was satisfied. Chroniclers note couples collapsing under the strain, choosing annulment not from triumph but from exhaustion. And yet, despite its cruelty, impotence trials reveal the strange balance of power in medieval marriage. For women trapped in loveless or abusive unions, accusing a husband of impotence was one of the few avenues to freedom. There are stories of clever wives exploiting this loophole, enlisting sympathetic witnesses, or feigning passion to make a husband's failure more damning. For some, humiliation became a weapon, a desperate gamble for autonomy. The social aftermath was brutal. Communities whispered, reputations crumbled, and men who failed were sometimes driven into exile. The trials turned sex into a courtroom drama, stripping away tenderness and replacing it with scrutiny and spectacle. It is hard not to shudder at the cruelty of it. Where we see intimacy, they saw evidence. Where we guard privacy, they imposed witnesses. And where we hope for love, they demanded proof of function. The impotence trial was less about truth than about control of bodies, control of marriages, control of futures. In these cold chambers of judgment, the medieval world exposed not only flesh but fear, the fear of illegitimacy, the fear of scandal, the fear of desire itself. If impotence trials exposed the cruelty of medieval marriage, another institution revealed its hypocrisy: the church itself. For centuries, the same clerics who thundered against lust from the pulpit quietly profited from it in the streets. In 12th century London, the Bishop of Winchester owned brothels in the district of Southwark, where over 1,000 prostitutes worked under clerical oversight, known as the Winchester geese. These women were regulated like livestock. They paid rent to brothel keepers, who in turn paid the church. The hierarchy was clear. At the bottom, women sold their bodies for survival. At the top, bishops collected the coin. Prostitution was framed as a necessary evil, a pressure valve to prevent worse sins like rape or adultery. And so the church became Europe's most powerful brothel landlord, financing chapels and festivals with the earnings of sin. London was not alone. In Paris, brothels clustered near the universities, tolerated and taxed by both church and crown. In Avignon, the papal city itself, clerics were accused of frequenting and protecting prostitutes. Venice, ever pragmatic, allowed state-regulated red light districts, their profits feeding the Republic's coffers. Wherever there was power, there was profit, and morality bent beneath it. Reformers who tried to close these systems met fierce resistance, not just from clergy, but from merchants, landlords, and city officials who all shared in the revenue. But while prostitution was woven into the fabric of society, women sought other, more desperate ways to control their bodies. Birth control in the Middle Ages was a patchwork of superstition, folk remedies, and dangerous concoctions. Some wore amulets of weasel testicles, believing that the animal's promiscuity with small litters could magically limit fertility. Others drank potions made from ground beaver testicles, iron filings, or worse, mercury. Many poisoned themselves in the process. There were methods both bizarre and brutal. Women inserted mixtures of honey, wool, and even crocodile dung to block conception, echoing similar practices from the ancient world. Half a lemon, used as a primitive cervical cap, appears in the record a strange flash of accidental ingenuity amid otherwise perilous remedies. Physicians recommended sneezing immediately after intercourse, carrying pepper to force it, convinced that expelling seed could halt pregnancy. Meanwhile, the one method that could work, the withdrawal technique, was condemned as deadly to men's health, said to cause madness, blindness, even death. Beneath the absurdity, however, lay desperation. Childbirth killed untold numbers of women. Too many mouths could doom a family to famine. For peasants living on the knife edge of survival, limiting pregnancy was not indulgence but necessity. And so they tried everything: stones, spells, herbs, prayers, poisons. Many of these methods failed, some killed, but they testify to a truth that echoes across centuries. The human need to wrestle with fate, to claim agency in the face of forces larger than oneself. When we step back from these stories, bundling bags, aphrodisiac feasts, bedding ceremonies, magical underwear, impotence trials, brothel-keeping bishops, and deadly contraception, we see not simply a society gone mad with superstition. We see ourselves refracted in another age. Medieval sexuality was a landscape of contradiction, restraint and indulgence, purity and hypocrisy, fear and longing. The medieval world tried to regulate desire with wood and cloth, with stars and prayers, with law and humiliation. Yet, in the end, nature always broke through. Couples bundled together in sacks still found ways to touch. Nobles paraded to their beds still knew private shame. Priests profiting from prostitution still thundered about sin on Sunday mornings. And women, risking their lives, still sought to control the burdens of fertility. Strip away the absurd rituals, the magical thinking, the cruelty of surveillance, and what remains is timeless. The human struggle to balance love, power, and survival. The need to control what so often feels uncontrollable. And the knowledge that even in the darkest ages, desire burned awkward, relentless, and profoundly human.